This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
The Red Apple Media Podcast Network presents This is Protecting America. Now, here's Emmy-winning journalist Rita Cosby.
And welcome to another edition of Protecting America. I'm Rita Cosby. Well, it was a big week in the Trump New York criminal trial as adult film star Stormy Daniels took to the witness stand. Meantime, Trump got great news in the Florida classified documents case and also in the Georgia election interference case. And for what this all means for the former president and for American justice, let's bring in Doug Burns, former federal prosecutor. Doug, it is so great to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure.
What are your thoughts about Stormy Daniels? Do you think she helped or did she hurt the prosecution's case?
No, I think she hurt their case. And it's interesting because a lot of people, and, I don't mean this in a mean-spirited way, a lot of people pontificating about the trial don't really understand how trials work. And the reason that's not a criticism is because they haven't been in trials. So the point is, prosecutors very, very, very often, seen the movie a million times, overplay their hand. So I've been in cases, for example, where the issue is, did the defendant steal the $1 million or did he earn the $1 million legitimately? And we sit there as time and time again, the government with a straight face, Your Honor, we want to put up this chart. That's the Rolex watch. And then over here, we want to put this chart, the Rolls Royce. And of course, all they're doing is trying to prejudice the jury. Because, by the way, little intellectual seminar, the Rolex watch has zero probative value, none. Doesn't prove at all whether he obtained the money legally or illegally. All it proves is that he bought a Rolex watch. So here it's the identical thing, okay? The case has little or nothing to do with this relationship or encounter, I'll call it, or alleged encounter, since the former president denies it, that happened 18 years ago. Yet in they come, by analogy to the charts with the Rolex, and she's going into all kinds of graphic detail about this. Even the judge, this is the key for a trial expert to unpack, even the judge gave away a lot, Rita, when he said, look, a lot of things were said that should have been left unsaid. That told me a lot. And it was a disgrace because all good judges, what they do is the minute a witness goes a little too far, I'll never forget one judge in Long Island. I won't name him. He's gone now. He turned to the jury. He goes, go back in the jury room, please. He just cleared the room. And then he said to the witness, look, you went on that tangent. I don't want you to do that again. It's called controlling the trial. So here, this judge just let her go on and on and on with all kinds of lurid details. Now, to your initial question, which is the key, is that it's very easy to misjudge jurors, okay? And they very well may be saying, why are they showing me all this lurid garbage? Why don't they just try to prove the case at hand?
Could it also taint the jury, too, even if they can't separate maybe the actual crime, but say, well, I really don't like Donald Trump or, gosh, he did this, if they believe Stormy Daniels? Do you think, obviously, that was the objective, just to muck Trump up?
Well, the objective was to prejudice him. And it's important, by the way, and that's why it's so nice to be able to explain in a little more detail on your podcast. Rule 403 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, and I know this case is in state court, but New York State has almost the identical provision, says that if the probative value of a piece of evidence is outweighed by its prejudice to the defendant, then it must be excluded, okay? Judge Merchan, you could teach that in every law school evidence class in America. This is the classic case of evidence which has very, very little probative value. It's really just tangential background. Because the point is, if they did an NDA, maybe it was based on this, you could just say it was based on some incident that happened. You don't even need to know what it is, by the way. So it has almost no probative value. The prejudice is manifest. There's tons of prejudice to the defendant, and it should clearly have been excluded. But this goes into the key mantra that we've been discussing, which is they don't really care, they being those who are against Trump. And I'll put the judge right in that group, Rita. They don't care if it gets reversed later. They just want to tag him with a conviction now in this horrific venue, New York City, so that they can argue to independent voters, you can't vote for a felon and a criminal.
So you believe, as I think a lot of people do, that this all comes down to politics and that this judge probably expects it'll be reversed on appeal, but he doesn't care because that's way down the road.
He doesn't care at all. And it's interesting because a number of people have asked me, and I've always found this fascinating, that people ask great common sense questions, people who don't know anything about law. And a number of people have asked me quite simply, Judge, doesn't this, Doug, I misspoke, Doug, doesn't this judge have like a supervisory judge, like his boss, that can step in and do something? And the explanation on that is that the reason this thing is so unbelievably cynical is because the judge's boss is the appellate division, the first department. That's the appeals court, to which an appeal is going to be heard. And the point is, the appeal doesn't happen until the case is over. And that's the whole point here. I mean, if you look, honestly, at the history, and some historian will write a book, and he'll have the E. Jean Carroll case, the Letitia James / Judge Engoron case, and this case. And they'll break it all down in detail, and they'll say this was just a breathtaking, political hit job. In the first two cases, by the way, they didn't give him any jury. They ruled a summary judgment, so he couldn't even defend himself. It was just incredible. And then tagged them with these science-fictional, ridiculously high numbers. Here you have a jury, and let me just say this. This cuts both ways, because on the one hand, everybody's been quick to say, myself included, it's a bad jury pool. 85% of the people voted against Donald Trump here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, a jury is different than not having a jury. And if these jurors conscientiously follow their oath, which is even if you dislike them, you're still going to follow the law and the facts, you should have at a minimum a hung jury, in my opinion.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
Now, we understand that there's a couple attorneys that are on the jury. Does that help or does that hurt?
No, very good question. I myself sat on a jury in Nassau County. Fascinating for me to be on the other side of the rail. It was really, really interesting. And what I found most interesting is none of the jurors turned to me ever and said, Doug, we know you're a lawyer. Nobody said that. And we just all found the facts. But generally speaking, if you have the weaker case, you don't want a lawyer. So I think a lawyer helps Trump, quite honestly, because if you really unpack, and I'm not getting all in the weeds, but if you unpack what he's actually charged with, there are serious, serious legal problems. You've heard, Andy McCarthy, Jonathan Turley, all lay it out brilliantly. And the point is he's charged with a misdemeanor of false business records, which was out of time, as you've heard, statute of limitations. And they bump it up to a felony based on a second misdemeanor, which is election interference by unlawful means. But the NDA, the non-disclosure agreement, is not unlawful. So a lawyer could be helpful to unpack some of that type of stuff in their own mind. And again, not to be a broken record, I do think I'm pretty confident in saying that there's a pretty halfway decent likelihood that you'll have one or two jurors who are not going to vote to convict him, Rita.
Wow, so it could be a hung jury is what you think at the end of the day.
That's what I'm predicting, basically. I'm going a little bit out on a limb, but I've been around the block, obviously, as you know, a lot of trials. Number of hung juries, by the way. I've seen it happen. And I'm very, very, very concerned, and you and I had discussed this somewhere along our media travels about the jury instructions, though. And the reason I'm concerned is that a judge can charge somebody out of a case. That's sort of a term of art that we trial lawyers use. Charging somebody out of the case means that you give sort of a very one-sided charge, which kind of shades the law. So I'll give an example from this case. One of the big issues here is whether or not the defendant did this for purposes of the election, and those who defend him say absolutely not. He did it for purposes of protecting his wife and his family. That's easy. What's not so easy is what if a jury should think, wait a minute, what if it's both? Okay, and we won't even put percentages on it. Part of it was election, part of it was family. This judge could easily, and this is a huge problem, could easily give a charge, because the law is not crystal clear, that, ladies and gentlemen, if you find that there were two purposes, dual purposes, you can find that it was election related. That would be devastating. That would charge the defendant right out of the case. And we'll see how he charges the jury. And it's the same broken record point, which is, that would be reversed probably on appeal, but they don't care.
Yeah, that is really important, just as you said, because if he opens the door or if he says it is solely for election interference, if that's the case, if he instructs the jury and says, okay, it has to be just election interference, I think if you're on that jury, you go, wait a minute. You heard some of the testimony, including from Hope Hicks, who is the longtime former confidant of the president, very close communications director. And she said, well, he was really worried about his wife. He didn't want the wife to get newspapers at the home. He didn't want this. She talked a lot about the wife. If he does say it's only for campaign for election, I think it's a 5-minute jury deliberation, and they go,
absolutely.
no, wait a minute. What did this Hope Hicks say? Wait a minute.
But he won't charge the jury in that fashion, is my point. And the point is that in the weeds of the Federal Election Commission regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations, what we lawyers call the CFR, I think there's a test in there, which is essentially whatever was the primary reason, primarily for the purpose, et cetera, et cetera. But they have a very weak factual record, by the way, on this question of election, because as you just said, and you're so right, there was a lot of testimony that it was for his wife. The bottom line from 30,000 feet, honestly, is that the facts have not been all that favorable to the prosecution at all. The law is horrific for the prosecutors for all the reasons laid out by no less a figure than a Boston University law professor whose article appeared in the New York Times, slamming the case legally. So the point is, it's weak legally, it's weak factually. But again, if the judge gives a poor jury instruction, you never know what will happen. But again, I expect there may be a hung jury. We'll see.
What did you make of Stormy Daniels? I mean, did you find her all over the place? I mean, there was a part in her testimony when she was being questioned by the prosecution where she said, well, I didn't want my husband to know, and that's why I was willing to get paid X amount for an NDA, which was sort of interesting because she's an adult film star and just want her husband to know that she had been with Donald Trump is her claim. But, it was interesting, Doug. Later on, then on cross-exam, they got her to admit that she, hey, if I get paid, what the heck? So, I mean, that her motivation was money in some regard, that it sort of washes out her credibility.
No, I thought her credibility was somewhat suspect. I don't just jump right on it. She's an adult film actress. You can't believe her. I don't believe that at all.
Right. I don't either, by the way. I don't either.
I'm just saying, and I'm not being politically correct. If you can corroborate a witness, back them up, fine. But I'm telling you right now, I was a prosecutor for 9 years, and I would have winced in my chair, if one of my witnesses were asked, do you hate the defendant? And the witness said yes. Okay, that is not good for the prosecutors, okay, because it shows that the person is biased. And would you like to see him in jail? she said something like, yes, I want to see him punished and held accountable. Well, wait a minute. That now makes the witness have a dog in the hunt. She has a motivation to fabricate. This is just basic legal principles, okay? So the point is, I thought it was a real mistake for them to call her in the way they did. I was extremely disappointed in the judge, obviously. He should have umpired the game way, way, way better. He himself knew full well that the stuff was inappropriate and that the probative value was outweighed by the prejudice. He then pulled what I would call a bit of a weasel move. He tried to blame the defense. You saw that, Rita. You didn't object enough. That's a little bit ridiculous because they had what we lawyers call a standing objection. They objected to her hitting the witness stand in the first place and objected all throughout her testimony. So that's well preserved for appeal. So again, this judge is not doing any favors for the American criminal justice system. Not to be corny, I went in front of many, many, many great judges, and they were interested in the truth, okay? Nothing fancy, not law books, not technicalities. They wanted to hear the truth. And if there was a defense version of something like, hey, this was done because of my wife, this was done because of my family, in addition to the state's claim that it was done for the election, these great judges would move forward in their chair and they would be genuinely interested in hearing both sides. That is not happening in this case.
Yeah, which is an astounding moment for American justice. On the other side, Doug Burns, there was some interesting news that also came about in the Florida classified documents case. The judge there, Eileen Cannon, said that she is postponing it indefinitely, that there's just too many issues in that case. That's big news for Trump because that means, of course, it's not going to make it. Jack Smith, who's the special counsel, as you know, in that case, he wanted, I think it was like July 8th, he wanted to move forward. And she's like, whoa, there are way too many issues. Describe why you think that happened. And also, does that indeed not make that case happen before Election Day now?
No, I don't think it's going to happen before Election Day. And to answer your question, there are a lot of serious questions about the way the evidence has been handled by the government. This is something that comes up, in cases day to day. Again, I feel like a broken record. Regular cases are not hysterically talked about in terms of will it go to trial. Let me be sarcastic for a minute. If the purpose of a criminal trial is that the defendant broke the law, we want to hold him to account, we want to see him punished if it's appropriate, then let me ask this question. Why does the case have to be before an election?
Right. And by the way, in the Alvin Bragg case, why did it come 8 years later, too? That's the other thing. Why did they wait?
So back to the the Florida case, while it sounds dramatic and it's like, who shot JR, from Dallas, 30 years ago, the point is it's of no consequence whatsoever whether a case goes to trial before or after an election. So you can imagine my frustration. Every single day, day in, day out, all day, I watch people saying, well, wait a minute, is this going to go to trial before? I saw a pundit on liberal cable, not a pundit, an anchor, couldn't believe it. And the pundit gave a perfectly good answer, similar to this, but not the identical issue, about how the case is going to be heard on immunity, and it's going to take a little time. And the anchor just flat out said, so wait a minute, you mean the case can't go before the election? And they were almost like bawling. Like
in tears, right,
yeah,
right.
And it's just so embarrassing from like a journalism point of view. But the point is, on the Florida case, the judge, sunlight's the best disinfectant. There are questions about the way the stuff's been numbered now as opposed to when it was first obtained, things like that. And it requires some pretrial hearings. And again, none of this would mean anything in a real-world case because real-world cases, they suffer adjournments, all the time in these hearings, and lawyers can't make it. And again, it has nothing to do with when an election is, okay?
Yeah, absolutely. But you're right. Everyone's going, wait a minute, we want more cases. We want more cases
That's
against
all it
Trump.
Is. They can. And by the way, this is interesting. Before I forget, people should wonder, why in the world would the first case that went to trial be the weakest one of all? This thing has so many holes in it. It's like the proverbial Swiss cheese. But the point is, they had, people don't make good decisions when they're angry. And their anger was, he can't pardon himself. You remember that? In a state case. Well, the Georgia case got all tangled up with all the problems. So they figured they'll go to trial in this New York State case. It was a huge mistake, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great point. You're right, because that could could be a case that hangs. You're right, that it goes back to get a state case, whatever one it is. If it's not the Georgia one, the New York one. You brought up the Georgia one, Doug Burns, and before we go, I want to make sure we hit on that because there was some other big news where Trump is now allowed to revisit his team getting Fani Willis kicked off as the Fulton County DA. Of course, we think about her, her whole thing with Nathan Wade and the lover. And I can't believe she didn't get removed by that judge. But clearly there were politics down in Georgia. But your thoughts of what's going to happen to Fani Willis ultimately? Do you think she'll stay on it or not?
First of all, I love your point because if the two of them, for the sake of argument, did something wrong, right? Just follow me. Both she and Nathan Wade, how do you come up with this Solomonic cut the baby in half decision, which is as long as one of you is off the case? That made absolutely no sense. But the judge, to his credit, certified it for appeal. In other words, you can't take an immediate appeal on something like that because it's called interlocutory. You have to wait till the case is over unless the judge certifies it. Okay, I myself was a little confused, and I'm not a Georgia lawyer, but hear me out. Just because it was certified, the Court of Appeals still has to accept it. So that's what happened. And now the Court of Appeals has, in fact, accepted it for review. So back to the whole hysteria point, the case is not going to trial before the election. That's point one. Point two, they very well may rule that both of them should have been kicked off the case, Rita.
Yeah, which is what I think a lot of us, when we watch that pathetic testimony by both of them, so back to everything, Doug Burns. Now we know, okay, that case looks like that's obviously on hiatus, at least short term, or the appeals will go through the processes. Then we got the Florida case, the immunity case. They're waiting to hear from the Supreme Court. That's the January 6th case, if you will. So you got all of these elements. It all goes back again to New York. So does that mean that New York may be the only Trump case that happens potentially before the election? And then does that put renewed pressure on Alvin Bragg, to your point?
No, absolutely. I mean, the point is, to repeat what you just said, the Georgia case is on appeal over the disqualification. That's going to take time. Not going to go to trial before the election. The J6 case is, before the Supreme Court, and they'll probably rule on it in June, right at the end of the term. They may hysterically try to get that case to trial, though, during the summer. So remember I said that. The documents case is on hold indefinitely. So I think you hit it right on the head, which is the only case that's going to be adjudicated most likely before the election is this New York one. And then possibly if they hysterically try to get that J6 case after the June ruling from the Supreme Court. But again, we don't know how the immunity issue is going to come back. And then's going to come, I'm chuckling, then's going to come a huge meltdown on the left. By the way, I just reminded myself because the Supreme Court's going to remand it for further findings as to what were considered official acts and what were considered acts outside the scope. That's going to take time, and you'll see a big meltdown about how the case is not going to go to trial before the election. But again, I must repeat, if the purpose of a criminal case is to punish an individual for violating the law, why in the world would it matter if it's before an election?
Yeah, exactly. It looks like it all comes down to politics on so many levels. And boy, it's become more and more transparent. Well, everybody be sure to subscribe and share to this great podcast. Doug Burns, thank you so much for being here and for your terrific legal insight always. You're always the best, my friend.
Much appreciated. Thank you for having me on.
And everybody, I'll be back soon with another great edition of Protecting America. And of course, you can catch me every weeknight, 10 p.m. to midnight on the legendary WABC Radio. This is Rita Cosby, and thanks for all you do to protect America.